The design of your research procedures encompasses your overall approach to research as well as the specific components of how it will be carried out. In choosing a research design, it's fine to start out with the idea of using experimental designs or survey research as an overall approach, but before starting, you're gonna need to iron out the specifics. What are your variables? How will you measure them? Who is eligible to be in your study and who is actually in it? Eventually, you are going to need to get very specific. In this lecture, we're going to focus on some of the key considerations involved in choosing an overall approach. In later lectures, we'll dig deeper into some of these different approaches to consider the specific types of choices involved. Now, a key point here is that there are a lot of choices. We could do an entire course on survey research, another one on experiments, and a third on ethnography. We could do multiple courses on each one. The goal of this course is not to make you an expert on any individual approach to research design, but it's to introduce you to the wide range of approaches available so you're equipped to know the best way to tackle your project. It's great to be an expert on survey research, but if your project is better suited for an individual case study, you'd be out of luck. So in this next section of the course, we're going to make sure you know what your options are. Now, there are a lot of ways to categorize different research methods. For our purposes in this course, we're going to use a straightforward and common way of organizing these methods, and we'll put them into two categories: quantitative and qualitative. Now, quantitative analysis generally involves using statistical tools to analyze large amounts of numerical data on a large number of cases. And qualitative analysis is typically looking at a smaller number of cases but more in-depth, using data that can't always be reduced to numbers. So, quantitative designs tend to produce data useful for quantitative analysis, and the same goes for qualitative designs. Now, that's not a rigid rule, by the way. You can do surveys that are analyzed qualitatively, and you can do quantitative analysis as part of a case study. But it's still a useful way to categorize some of our options, so for now, let's work with this division. Now, I'm not going to talk about every possible methodology you could use within each of these categories, but here I'm going to briefly introduce some of the most dominant methods used in research. In future lectures, we're going to go into more depth on how to do each of these. We're going to focus on three kinds of generally quantitative approaches: experimental designs, observational designs such as cross-sectional and longitudinal studies, and large-scale survey research. Now, experimental designs, proper controlled experiments with random assignment, controls, and treatments, they produce a kind of magic that allows us to be very precise about the connections between our variables. They let us do all kinds of things that other designs don't let us. We can control how variables are manipulated for our subjects, letting us really isolate the impact of variables that we think matter. The researcher has a lot of control over how the data is collected. And because of this, there's a good rule of thumb to follow. If you can answer your research question using a proper experiment, you probably should. This is one reason why the natural sciences tend to focus largely on experiments. Chemicals, plants, minerals, they pretty rarely protest at participating in an experiment. Experiments are also widely used in psychology, and the principles of experimental design can be applied to surveys and other kinds of studies, as we'll learn about. But plenty of questions and projects do not lend themselves to experimenting, so you might need to pick a different method. Now, that method might be cross-sectional or longitudinal studies. If experiments are magic, then these more observational style studies are good old-fashioned detective work. With these methods, we can't control our subjects the same way we can with experiments, but instead of manipulating variables and seeing what happens, we have to simply observe the world as it is and figure out what we can about how it works. The typical approach is to take a large data set that has information on a host of variables, and then we'll conduct statistical analysis to look for correlation or causation. A cross-sectional design examines a set of cases at a single point in time, as if you were making a cut across space to look at a wide cross-section of a population. Now, that population might be individuals, as in a national survey. In such cases, you're taking a cross-section of people, and you're reviewing their attitudes, behaviors, or beliefs at a particular point in time. But you could also compare different countries to each other at a single point in history, or businesses, or organizations, or households, or anything really. Now, longitudinal designs look at a case over time. They let you look at trends and changes over time by gathering multiple points of data about a case over a period of time. This can be particularly useful if variables change in value. If, for example, you study a single country from 1815 to 2015, you might see massive changes that can be attributed to a change in a single variable over 200 years. You can actually combine both of these methods and do a design that is both cross-sectional and longitudinal. In such a study, you would compare different units to each other over time. If you wanted to compare the experiences of children in different parts of the United States as they grow from birth to adulthood, you'd be conducting a study that is both cross-sectional and longitudinal. And you can also do correlational studies that focus on looking for relationships between variables, often in existing data sets or ones that you build. Now, we aren't going to have a separate lecture on all these designs, but it's important to know about them as you may want to do a study that requires statistical analysis of big data sets. Another quantitative method is large-scale survey research, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, is actually a type of cross-sectional design. But it's important enough in its own right to be discussed separately, as surveys are a commonly used tool in research. In survey research, you distribute questionnaires to large numbers of people to determine their characteristics, behaviors, attitudes, values, or beliefs. Rather than experimenting on people and observing the results, you're going to let people self-report and then examine what they say. You might also compare groups across demographic indicators, which is why many surveys ask about a respondent's age, gender, race, income, and education levels. Now, what about our more qualitative approaches? These approaches generally focus on a smaller number of cases. Quantitative methods tend to sacrifice depth for breadth. We don't generally know a lot about any single case or subject, but the high variation in subjects generally gives us more room to draw conclusions about a wider population. Qualitative methods, on the other hand, allow for richer description and can be better at identifying causal mechanisms that help us understand why one variable might create change in another. Now, the principal qualitative methods we're going to review are case studies, field research, and action and evaluation research. First, we have case studies. This is any in-depth study of one or a small number of, cases, which might be individuals or groups of people, organizations, countries, states, businesses, events. The goal is to engage in extensive and in-depth description, interpretation, or explanation of the case or cases. The purpose may be to simply provide rich detail and description of a previously unknown case, to explore whether theoretical ideas apply to a specific example, or to trace the causal mechanisms connecting a set of variables. Field research is a term that captures quite a few approaches. In general, it means to go out into the field, to leave your office or home and go to the place of the people or things that you're studying. You might observe the behavior of your subjects, as a biologist might by studying animals in their natural habitat. You might instead engage in participant observation, where you become a member of the community that you hope to study or interact with your subjects as you study them. Or you might interview your subjects of interest, one-on-one in traditional interviews or in focus groups that might meet once or several times. And one of the better known types of this methodology is ethnography. It's a commonly used methodology in anthropology as well as in other fields. This usually entails extensive time spent in the culture or with the subjects under study, observing them in such a way as to produce thick description of those subjects, as Clifford Geertz famously did in his study of Balinese cockfights in his book, The Interpretation of Cultures. Finally, we have applied research. This is in the form of action and evaluation research. Most of the methodologies we've discussed so far focus on answering questions to satisfy our own curiosity, advance knowledge, solve puzzles, or to learn things about wider groups, even if we only study a small subset of the group we're actually interested in. Action research focuses on helping a specific group or community. It's frequently normative in its purpose, interested in resolving a problem rather than looking at wider patterns or puzzles for the sake of advancing knowledge. Instead, action research, it wants to use research to improve lives. If we can see research as a cocktail party, then action research is the person who charges the stage, takes over the microphone, and gives an impassioned speech that goes viral and makes change happen. Evaluation research, used frequently in research on education as well as many other areas, aims at evaluating the effectiveness of programs, actions, or behaviors, and their ability to solve the problem for which they were created. Typically, it involves establishing criteria for assessing the effectiveness of a program, and then the researchers analyze the program's achievement of those criteria as well as its strengths and weaknesses. So we've looked at some of the main kinds of research design, but before you can employ these methods and gather any data, you must determine your unit of analysis. That is the unit, the person, organization, government, country about which you are gathering the data. It's basically an organizing element that can guide your data collection efforts. Imagine you are interested in studying employee productivity. There are lots of ways to approach such a project. Do you want to know the productivity of individual employees, teams, offices or locations, cohorts of workers? Each of these is a unit. Whatever unit you choose is going to determine the data you collect and how it's organized. If your unit is the individual worker, you might look at the hours each person worked, the number of projects an employee completed in a year, or the total sales made by that person. But if your unit of analysis is instead an office, you wouldn't need data that's so individualized. You might want to know about total overtime paid or total sales at the office level. Which one you choose is going to depend on the purpose of your research. So if the goal is to find a high-performing employee for an award, then an individual level unit of analysis makes sense. If instead you are tasked with closing down the poorest performing office among several offices, then individual data isn't as useful. You probably need aggregate data about each office. It may be that your star employee who just won that award works at the lowest performing office. That person's data is still not going to stop you from shutting down that office. Sometimes you will want nested units. This means that you are looking at units within a unit. In our business example, this would mean getting data on a subset of employees within a specific office. So the individual level unit of analysis is embedded within that office unit of analysis. If our task was to find the high-performing employees in poorly performing offices so we can reassign them to a new location, then this kind of unit choice would be useful. The point is, knowing your unit of analysis is vital before you start gathering data. Otherwise, you're going to gather data in a haphazard way, and we strive to be as systematic as possible when it comes to research. So that is a lot of options for research designs. How are you supposed to choose which one is best for your project? Well, let's start with several key considerations to keep in mind when choosing a research design for your project. First, you need to consider your time and the resources available to you. The ideal design might require you to conduct your own data collection, but perhaps similar data is already available for free or a small fee. Running your own survey or experiment, it takes a lot of time and resources, so you should not feel compelled to do that for their own sake. For example, let's consider polls. Public opinion polling firms conduct polls all the time. The General Social Survey, for example, has asked questions about American behaviors and attitudes since 1972. Questions cover a wide variety of topics, from premarital sex to your television habits and how often you socialize with friends and family. Rather than conduct your own survey on these topics, your time and money would be better spent using existing publicly available data. This, by the way, is another great reason to do your literature review sooner rather than later. By reading what data other researchers have compiled and used in this area, you'll find out what's available and potentially save yourself a lot of time and effort. Now, what if the data doesn't exist? The second consideration is whether or not there's a good reason why the data is missing. In some cases, it may be that no one has worked on a project from the angle that you have, or that the specific case or sample you want to study hasn't been tackled yet. But in some cases, the data you want may actually be really difficult or even unethical to obtain. For example, you may want to study the experiences of victims of domestic violence who still live with their abusive partners. It might be difficult to convince them to talk to you for the purposes of research. And if they agree, your work could pose serious ethical risks to you or them. As a researcher, you're supposed to protect the confidentiality of your subjects. But if your subjects tell you about ongoing experiences of violence, would you be able to stay silent? That's if, of course, your ethical review board allows the research to move forward in the first place. So always consider the difficulty and ethics of acquiring the data that you would need. A third consideration is your own skill level. You may lack the skill to do the specific study that you want. It might require advanced data analysis or formal modeling, or you might need to interview subjects in a language you don't speak. Some of these considerations can be solved by grants or other sources of funding. You might be able to hire an interpreter. But in other cases, you might consider collaborating with another researcher that can offer those skills. So either pick a research design you're confident that you can carry out, or have a plan to compensate for those areas where you might need assistance. Since I mentioned funding a moment ago, let's talk about that as our fourth consideration in the choice of research design. There is a lot of great research that can be done with no funding at all, but as in most things, money certainly helps. And for some research, it is absolutely necessary. Want to recreate Clifford Geertz's work and watch some cockfights in Bali? Well, you'll need a plane ticket, a living stipend, and possibly an interpreter or some language lessons. Surveys may require you to hire people to act as interviewers. One-on-one interviews may necessitate the hiring of a transcriber. You may need physical equipment for your research, particularly in the natural sciences, or you may need to offer an incentive to motivate people to sign up for your experiment or focus group. If you want to publish your results, some fields are turning more and more to open access publication, which can cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. All of these are the kinds of costs that you should try not to pay out of pocket. As you design your research, you're going to want to develop a budget that considers the costs of all stages of the project. Now, the good news is that there are a number of organizations out there that provide grants to fund research. If your project is something that was handed to you at your work, it is reasonable to ask for a research budget to support costs. Many academics receive a research budget to support their research from their universities, and so if conducting research is part of your job, definitely investigate the support available from your employer. That may be the easiest way to get the resources that you need. If not, it's time to look to other sources. Now, there are a number of foundations, professional associations, and government bodies that provide grants to support research. These are usually competitive processes, and you may need to apply pretty far in advance. The National Science Foundation, for example, approves approximately 11,000 proposals of the 50,000 submitted every year to support research. Depending on the type of grant, you may be subjected to pretty strict regulations and reporting requirements. Generally, when someone gives you money for something, they want strong evidence that it was spent effectively and had the impact that they were told that it would. That can create some problematic incentives, by the way. Sometimes our research doesn't turn out the way we want. We don't get the results we expected, or we weren't able to talk to the people we thought we could, or our survey response rate was unexpectedly low. Most granting institutions understand that, but at the same time, you might be tempted to artificially inflate your findings, perhaps so that you're considered for future grants, simply to justify the institution's faith in you, or because you believe that your career might be damaged if you report disappointing results. This raises clear ethical concerns that you should be aware of. Certainly, you should resist any and all impulses to falsify your research. And if ever a granting institution encourages you to claim specific findings or to massage your results to show what isn't there, don't give in. And maybe don't accept their money. A final set of considerations for your choice of research design has to do with the structure of your question and variables. There is a reason why certain approaches are associated with certain disciplines, like field work with anthropology and experiments with the natural sciences and psychology. It's at least partly due to the fact that the kinds of questions those fields are interested in can best be answered using those methodologies. Interviewing a hydrogen atom is not going to do much good, after all. Now, in my own field of international relations, conducting a true experiment is pretty difficult. I'd love to be able to convince, say, North Korea to try democracy for a while, just for the sake of research, so I can study how the society changes under different systems of government. But that's not exactly going to work out. I can't exactly manipulate variables in countries the way a chemist could in a chemistry lab. So what kinds of factors should you pay attention to as you decide what methodological approach to use? Well, one is whether or not you can control the administration of your treatment. That is, can you assign which value of your independent variable that a case falls into? Recall that, as we discussed previously, the independent variable is the factor in experiment that we vary to determine its effect on the dependent variable. In the case of studying democracy in North Korea, I can't determine which value on my independent variable the case belongs in. My independent variable is type of government. It's not up to me to decide which system of government any country has. In an experiment, I'd be able to randomly assign governments to countries and then observe the effects. Let's look at a different example. If I were studying the impact of a business's size on its treatment of its employees, my independent variable is business size, and my dependent variable, treatment of employees. I wouldn't be able to tell one company to be large and another to be small. I'd have to work with what already exists. Compare this to questions that lend themselves better to experiments. If I want to know the impact of playing with puppies on people's moods, I actually can decide whether or not someone gets to play with a puppy. I can take my subjects, divide them into two groups, and then give one group puppies. In that sense, I can manipulate the administration of my treatment. Now, there is such a thing as quasi-experimental designs that let us work around this issue of manipulating the treatment, and we will discuss them in a future lecture. A second factor is controlling for alternative variables, alternatives to the independent variable or treatment that you really want to investigate. Are you able to isolate the factors that you think play a role in whatever outcome of interest you might have from those that you think don't matter? In an experiment, you can institute these controls yourself. You introduce a treatment to one randomly selected set of subjects, but not others, making your variable of interest the one that varies. You can also eliminate other variables by ensuring they're the same for everyone. For example, if you're doing that study on whether playing with puppies improves people's moods, you could make sure that both groups, those that play with puppies and those that don't, spend time in exactly the same room. Otherwise, the design elements or environmental conditions in that room, the furniture, the temperature, the size, might affect mood. Using the same room eliminates that variable from consideration. You don't need an experiment to control for other variables. Sometimes you can select cases that provide some of these controls. If I'm interested in the impact of government type on social and economic outcomes, for example, I could pick countries that are similar in many respects, geography, size, or dominant language, for example, but which vary on their type of government. If countries of the same size have radically different social and economic outcomes, I can probably safely eliminate size as a cause of those outcomes. In our business example from earlier, you could study companies that are very similar except for size, and therefore control for and eliminate from consideration those factors that were similar. Or you could just look at small companies and see if there are any differences between them when it comes to treatment of employees. Now, what about large correlation studies using big data sets? You can control there too. When you analyze big data sets with lots of variables, you can use statistical methods to control for alternative explanations. And we will talk about how to do this in a future lecture. Now, of course, sometimes you don't actually care about controlling for or manipulating variables at all. If your work is focused on description, then manipulation and control aren't really key considerations for you. An experiment would be unsuitable, but fieldwork or focus groups might be just right. A third factor to consider is the number of subjects or cases that you either need or have access to. If your project requires you to analyze a large number of cases, then you need to choose a method that can more readily produce that data. Experiments and surveys tend to produce data that lends themselves to quantitative analysis. So does the building or use of large data sets in correlation research. But if your question instead requires that you go more in-depth on a single or small number of cases or subjects, you are better off choosing fieldwork, focus groups, interviews, or archival work. Your ideal choice may be constrained by funding, skills, or any of the other key considerations we discussed earlier that are going to influence your choice of design. The point here is that such considerations may limit or expand your access to subjects, and the number of subjects you want or need will in part dictate your choice of design. In our puppy example, the more people, the merrier. The larger our number of cases, our N as we sometimes call it, generally the better our statistical tools will be at telling us whether playing with puppies improves moods. In the case of looking at the impact of government type on social and economic outcomes, I'm probably going to want to use existing data sets or build my own that looks at many countries over time. A cross-sectional and longitudinal analysis will let me not only compare different countries to each other, but the same country to itself over time as its regime changes. Now, that is a tall order, and it's going to require some pretty serious stats chops. And there may also be a lot of missing data. So I could instead do a case study or two, looking in depth at a single country or a handful, and really dig into the causal mechanisms underlying why government type might influence my outcomes of interest. There's a similar choice in our business example. You could get data on hundreds of companies, their size, and some metrics on employee treatment. Or you could pick a few and do some in-depth case studies. Both are valid approaches. In this case, for both types of examples, the type of question narrows the choice of available methods, but it doesn't force you to pick just one. Experiments might be out for both of those projects, but that doesn't mean you're forced to do a large and quantitative study. Some of the best research takes what is called a mixed method approach. This usually means a combination of methods, perhaps a quantitative study to look at the breadth of information on a set of subjects, and then a qualitative study to investigate details or causal mechanisms of a few relevant cases. This combination of breadth and depth can be a very powerful way to get at the answers to your research questions. Okay, we have considered a lot of factors that influence what type of design you should choose. At this point, you should be ready to identify the type of data you need to answer your question and the method you're going to use to find and analyze that data. I know you're raring to go, but you still have a couple of decisions to make before you can start designing your experiment, survey, or case study. First, we have to figure out how to measure our variables. That is, how are we defining them, and how will we know them when we see them? How will I know if someone is in a good mood after playing with a puppy? What are the markers of a well-treated employee versus a poorly treated one? What exactly are those social and economic outcomes I keep referring to, and how will I compare them in one country versus another? All of that is part of measurement, the subject of our next lecture. After that, we have to figure out the methods we're going to use to find subjects or cases and to ensure that they can tell us something about a wider population. I might only check the post-puppy playing moods of 100 people, but I'm not doing a study solely to say something about those 100 people. I want to be able to say something about a wider population, say of all adults. To do that, I need to be systematic in how I choose my sample so it reflects that wider population. So after measurement, we'll turn to populations and samples. And then we'll start our in-depth look at the various methodologies we started to consider here. See you then.